Chicago, 1929. A city pulsing with ambition, wealth, and a darkness that thrived in the shadows. Prohibition had turned criminals into kings, and in the underworld, loyalty was as fleeting as the smoke rising from a gangster's cigarette. The streets were alive with whispers of power, backroom deals sealed with handshakes, and vendettas that ended in blood. The law held no meaning here. Not when the right bribe could turn a judge, silence a witness, or erase a man from existence. But beneath the surface of this booming metropolis, a war was brewing. Two forces, both ruthless, both unwilling to yield, had drawn a battle line that stretched across Chicago's underworld. On one side stood Al Capone, Scarface to his enemies, the undisputed ruler of the South Side, a man who controlled an empire of bootlegging, gambling, and vice with an iron fist. His influence extended beyond the criminal world, reaching deep into politics, the police, and even the press. To many, he was untouchable. To his followers, he was a legend. And then there was George "Bugs" Moran, the last obstacle standing in Capone's way. The North Side boss, a man whose hatred for Capone burned like a fire that would not be extinguished. His men were fierce, loyal, and just as hungry for power. Between them, the rivalry had escalated beyond business. This was not about money anymore. It was about dominance, revenge, and the destruction of anyone who dared to stand in the way. The streets of Chicago had seen their fair share of violence. Drive-by shootings, ambushes, assassinations carried out in broad daylight. This was the language of gangsters. The police had grown used to it. Reporters had grown numb to it. The people of Chicago, they had come to expect it. But none of them knew what was coming. None of them could predict the horror that would unfold on Valentine's Day. None of them realized that February 14, 1929, would become the most infamous day in organized crime history. For in a small, unassuming garage on North Clark Street, a trap had already been set. A plan, months in the making, was about to be executed. And when the sun rose over the city that morning, it cast its light on men who had only hours left to live. Al Capone and Bugs Moran had never met face to face. They had never shaken hands, never exchanged words, never even stood in the same room together. And yet, their names were forever bound by a hatred so deep that neither would rest until the other was gone. Capone's rise to power had been swift and brutal. He was more than just a gangster. He was a tactician, a businessman, a man who understood that fear was the greatest currency of all. His organization ran like a machine, with bootlegging operations stretching from Chicago to Canada, speakeasies that flowed with illegal liquor, and politicians who turned a blind eye in exchange for a well-placed envelope of cash. He made enemies, but he also made himself untouchable. Or so he believed. Bugs Moran had built his empire differently. He didn't rely on political favors or financial influence. He ruled through brute force, through the kind of loyalty that came from shared bloodshed. His North Side gang had once been led by Dion O'Banion, a man who had laughed in the face of death until Capone's men arranged his execution in a flower shop. After that, the war began in earnest. Assassinations became routine. One by one, Moran's top men fell, Jamie Weiss, Vincent Drucci, until Moran himself was the last one standing. And he wasn't afraid to fight. Their battles played out across the city like a deadly game of chess. Bombings, ambushes, machine gun fire in the dead of night, bodies turned up in alleyways, on sidewalks, in moving cars that never reached their destinations. Moran made it personal when he ordered a hit on one of Capone's top men. Capone made it clear there would be no forgiveness when he struck back with twice the force. But the war wasn't just about bodies, it was about business. Moran's gang was still a threat to Capone's control of the city's lucrative bootlegging trade. They hijacked shipments, strong-armed speakeasy owners, and refused to bow to Capone's rule. Capone had money, power, and connections. Moran had resilience, rage, and just enough men willing to die for him. And so, Capone made a decision. If Moran wouldn't kneel, he would be erased. The plan was simple. The execution? Flawless. By the time Bugs Moran realized what was happening, it would already be too late. A single, deadly trap would be set in motion, one that would change the course of organized crime forever. Valentine's Day was coming. And with it, the final chapter in a war that had gone on for far too long. February 14th, 1929. A day like any other in Chicago. The wind cut through the streets like a blade, cold and sharp, slipping through the cracks of the city's endless maze of alleyways and towering buildings. The city moved as it always did, fast, loud, alive. No one suspected that, in just a few hours, history would be rewritten in blood. It started with a simple message, an offer too good to refuse. A shipment of high-quality Canadian whiskey had arrived in Chicago ready for sale, untouched by police interference. The supplier was reliable. The location was safe. The deal was set to take place at 10:30 a.m. inside a garage at 2122 North Clark Street. A prime opportunity for Moran's men to restock their supply, expand their control, and, most importantly, make sure Capone's grip on the city loosened just a little more. They had no reason to question it. The garage belonged to one of their own, SMC Cartage Company, a warehouse often used by Moran's crew for storing bootleg liquor and stolen goods. There, 7 of his top men would gather to secure the shipment, including Frank Gusenberg, a feared enforcer with a reputation for surviving the kind of gunfights that left others in the morgue, and his brother Peter, a loyal soldier in Moran's war against Capone. The others, Albert Kachelek, Adam Heyer, Reinhard Schwimmer, John May, and James Clark, were hardened criminals, men who had seen their fair share of bloodshed but had no idea that today would be their last. But Bugs Moran himself? He was running late. As he left his apartment that morning, dressed in his usual overcoat and fedora, he had no idea that a simple delay, a few extra minutes in the comfort of warmth before stepping into the bitter Chicago cold, would be the only thing that saved his life. As he made his way toward the garage, he spotted something that made him stop in his tracks: uniformed police officers entering the building. His heart pounded. A raid? Had someone tipped off the cops? Had his men been arrested? He ducked into a nearby cafe, watching from a distance, hesitant to approach. But inside that garage, the men weren't cops. They weren't there to make arrests. They were there to kill. Inside the garage, the air was thick with the scent of oil and metal. Dust clung to the concrete floor, settling into the deep tire grooves left by the trucks that had come and gone over the years. 7 men stood waiting, unaware that the next few minutes would be their last. Some leaned against crates of liquor, talking in low voices. Others checked their watches, expecting Moran to arrive at any moment. None of them suspected the betrayal that was about to unfold. Then, the door opened. The sound of heavy boots echoed against the walls as 5 men stepped inside. 3 of them wore the dark blue uniforms of Chicago police officers, their badges catching the dim light. The other 2 were dressed in civilian clothes, men who, to any outside observer, looked like plainclothes detectives. It wasn't unusual to see police during Prohibition, not in a city where bribes were as common as bullets. A raid wasn't out of the question, but it wasn't a cause for panic either. It was just business as usual. Pay the right people, say the right words, and walk away. That's what the men in the garage thought. That's what they assumed. Then, the order came. Line up against the wall. No one argued. They had been through this before. A shakedown, maybe. A warning. Maybe even a negotiation. The men did as they were told, turning to face the cold, unyielding brick of the garage's back wall. Their hands lifted slightly, some pressing their palms flat against the surface, others stuffing them into their coat pockets. Their breaths came out in slow clouds, visible in the freezing February air. Behind them, the imposters moved into position. No questions were asked, no charges were read. And then, the first gunshot, a deafening explosion of sound in the confined space. Then another, and another. The Thompson submachine guns roared to life, their rapid fire filling every inch of the garage with chaos and destruction. The brick wall became a canvas of blood and bone, bullets tearing through flesh, ripping through bodies as if they were nothing more than paper targets. Some of the men collapsed instantly, their bodies crumpling into lifeless heaps. Others twitched and gasped, their fingers clawing at the floor in a desperate attempt to hold on to life. But there was no mercy here. The guns did not stop until the magazines were empty, until every last body had gone still. Then, just as quickly as they had arrived, the killers left. The gunmen in police uniforms walked out in formation, their deception complete. Outside, a black Cadillac was waiting. They climbed in without a word, the engine roaring to life as they disappeared into the city streets. To anyone passing by, it looked like officers had just conducted a routine raid. No one had any reason to question it. No one realized that inside that garage, Chicago's underworld had just changed forever. For a moment, after the last shot was fired, the garage was silent. No voices, no footsteps, just the lingering echoes of machine gun fire still ringing through the air, fading into the cold morning outside. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic tang of blood soaking into the concrete floor, pooling beneath the bodies that lay motionless against the bullet-riddled brick wall. And then a sound, so faint, so fragile it barely broke the stillness, a breath, a wheeze, a struggle for life. Frank Gusenberg was still alive. Barely. His body was riddled with bullets, but somehow, against all odds, he clung to the last threads of consciousness. His fingers twitched. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. His mind, clouded by pain, still grasped at one final, desperate thought: escape. He tried to move. He couldn't. His legs would not obey him. His arms felt impossibly heavy. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a low, wet gurgle. Minutes passed. It could have been 5. It could have been 20. Time had no meaning inside that slaughterhouse. Outside, the city continues as if nothing had happened. Cars rumbled past. Pedestrians walked the sidewalks. Businesses opened their doors. The world moved on, oblivious to the horror that had just unfolded behind those garage doors. And then, finally, someone entered. A mechanic, arriving late for work, stepped inside, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The walls, painted with blood. The floor, littered with bodies. 7 men crumpled like discarded dolls, their suits torn and soaked in deep red. The smell was overwhelming. The silence, suffocating. And then a movement, a sound, a sign of life. Frank Gusenberg, still breathing, still trying to speak. The mechanic stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind struggling to make sense of the carnage before him. Then reality snapped into focus. He turned and ran, his footsteps slamming against the pavement as he rushed to find a phone. The call went out. The police were on their way. Within minutes, sirens screamed through the streets, drawing closer and closer to North Clark Street. Chicago was about to wake up to the news of its darkest Valentine's Day. The first squad car screeched to a halt outside the garage, its siren dying as uniformed officers spilled onto the sidewalk. Neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the wailing sirens and the panicked shouts of the mechanic who had made the call. A few brave souls peered inside, only to recoil in horror. The scent of death was already thick in the air. The officers stepped cautiously into the dimly lit garage, their polished boots splashing through the pools of blood spreading across the cold concrete floor. The first thing they saw was the wall, perforated with bullet holes, blackened by gunpowder residue, streaked with thick, glistening smears of red where bodies had slid downward. And then their eyes fell to the corpses. 7 men, or what was left of them. Frank Gusenberg lay among them, gasping, his blood pooling around him in a growing tide. One officer knelt beside him, pressing a hand against his chest to feel the faint rhythm of his struggling heart. He leaned in, his voice low but urgent. "Who did this to you, Frank?" For a moment it seemed like Gusenberg would answer. His lips parted. A gurgling rasp emerged from his throat. His eyes, glassy and unfocused, shifted slightly. But then, in a final act of defiance, a gangster's code of silence still clinging to his last breath, he managed only 2 words before the darkness swallowed him whole. "Nobody shot me." And then he was gone. The officers exchanged grim looks. They knew better. The room told the story of him, the shattered bodies, the execution-style lineup, the merciless precision of the gunfire. This wasn't a random hit. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something bigger, something organized. Something meant to send a message. One officer turned to another, his voice low and steady. "Get the reporters down here. The whole city's gonna want to see this." And with that, the Valentine's Day Massacre was no longer just another gangland killing. It was something else entirely. A moment that would shake Chicago to its core. A crime so brutal that even a city numb to violence would struggle to comprehend it. Photographers rushed to the scene, their cameras flashing as they captured the horror in black and white. Within hours, the images would spread across the country, splashed across front pages, fueling speculation, outrage, and fear. The question wasn't just who had done this. Everyone already knew the answer, even if they didn't say it out loud. The question was, what came next, and would anyone dare to stop it? The massacre sent a shockwave through Chicago's underworld, but no one needed an official statement to know who was behind it. There were no witnesses, no signed confessions, no direct evidence, but there was Capone. His name lingered in every whispered conversation, in every trembling breath of those who dared to speak about what had happened. The streets knew, the gangs knew, the city knew. But proving it? That was another matter entirely. By the time police launched their investigation, Capone was nowhere near Chicago. He was hundreds of miles away, basking in the sun at his Palm Island estate in Miami. It was an alibi so perfect, so untouchable, that even the most determined investigators could do nothing but grit their teeth in frustration. He hadn't pulled the trigger. He hadn't been in the city. And yet everyone knew that nothing in Chicago's underworld happened without his blessing. Still, there were threads to pull, clues left behind in the chaos. The use of Thompson's submachine guns suggested professional killers, men who knew how to handle weapons designed for war. The precision of the attack, the cold efficiency, the police disguises, it all spoke to a level of planning beyond the usual gangland bloodshed. Someone had orchestrated this with military precision. Someone with power. Someone with reach. And then, there was the biggest clue of all, the intended target who had never arrived. Bugs Moran. The man who should have been standing against that brick wall with his men. The man who should have been among the dead. But by sheer luck, by a delay of mere minutes, he had escaped. And now, he was angry. Moran wasted no time blaming Capone. He didn't need proof. To him, it was obvious. The attack had Capone's signature all over it. Swift, brutal, total annihilation. But Moran wasn't interested in running to the police. He wanted revenge. The problem was, he no longer had an army to fight with. The massacre had shattered his power, leaving his operation in ruins. He was still alive, but for how much longer? And as for Capone, he didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat, he didn't need to. The message had been sent. The Northside gang was finished. No one dared challenge him now. He had taken Chicago, not with a vote, not with a handshake, but with blood. But what Capone didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that this act of brutality wouldn't just cement his power. It would also be the beginning of his downfall. For years, Chicago had tolerated Al Capone. He was the devil they knew, the ruler of an empire built on blood and prohibition. People whispered about his crimes but turned a blind eye because, for many, life under Capone meant access to the very things the law had taken away: booze, gambling, protection. He was a gangster, yes, but he was also a businessman. A man who handed out turkeys on Thanksgiving. A man who smiled for the newspapers, dressed in fine suits, cigars always in hand. But the Valentine's Day massacre changed everything. The photographs hit the front pages first. Gruesome, unfiltered images of the 7 bodies slumped against the bullet-riddled wall, their blood still fresh, their faces frozen in the final moments of horror. The public had seen violence before, but never like this. Never so cold, never so absolute. It wasn't just another gangland killing, it was an execution, a slaughter, and it was too much. The city turned. People who had once chuckled at Capone's larger-than-life persona now saw him for what he truly was. A butcher. A man who ruled through terror and left nothing but corpses in his wake. Even those who had once benefited from his empire, business owners who paid for protection, cops who had taken his bribes, began to fear they could be next. If he could do this to Moran's men, what was stopping him from doing it to anyone who crossed him? The newspapers wasted no time. Capone's reign of terror, Valentine's Day massacre, Chicago under siege. When will the killing end? For the first time, Capone wasn't just a problem for law enforcement. He was a problem for the public. And when the people demanded action, the government listened. The pressure mounted. Local police were humiliated. This massacre had happened on their watch, and they had no suspects, no arrests, nothing but speculation. The Chicago mayor's office, desperate to salvage the city's reputation, called for a crackdown. And in Washington, a name long whispered in Capone's shadow finally stepped into the light. Eliot Ness. A federal agent, young but relentless. He had been tasked with bringing down Capone before, but now he had public support. Now he had funding. Now he had a reason to escalate his war against Chicago's most powerful criminal. Capone had won the battle, but he had made one fatal mistake. He had made himself the enemy of the people. The massacre had done what bullets never could. It made Al Capone vulnerable. The public wanted justice, and the government was ready to deliver it. But Capone was no common thug. He was an empire. Taking him down wouldn't be easy. It would take men who couldn't be bribed, men who wouldn't be intimidated, men who didn't fear the consequences of going after the most dangerous man in America. Enter Eliot Ness and his Untouchables, a special federal task force handpicked for one purpose: to dismantle Capone's organization piece by piece. They weren't the corrupt Chicago police who looked the other way in exchange for thick envelopes of cash. They were federal agents, immune to the threats and temptations that had kept Capone safe for so long. They couldn't be bought. They wouldn't be scared off. And for the first time, Capone had real enemies. At first, he laughed them off. He had survived countless assassination attempts, dodged charges, and walked out of courtrooms untouched. What could these clean-cut government men possibly do to him? Then, the raids started. One by one, his breweries were shut down. His hidden warehouses were ransacked. His money laundering operations were disrupted. Ness and his men worked relentlessly, kicking in doors, seizing shipments, cutting off the lifeblood of Capone's empire, his money. Without it, his power began to shrink. His loyal men started looking out for themselves, whispering about jumping ship before it was too late. Capone responded the only way he knew how, with violence. He ordered hits on suspected informants. He sent men to shadow Ness, to intimidate him, to make him disappear. But Ness didn't break. He fought back, not with guns, but with something even deadlier: evidence. He knew he couldn't pin the Valentine's Day massacre on Capone. There were no witnesses willing to talk, no direct links. But Capone had a weakness that even bullets couldn't stop: taxes. Capone had built an empire worth millions, but he had never paid a dime in income tax. To a man like Capone, taxes were a joke, but to the government, they were a weapon. Ness and his team worked tirelessly, tracking every dollar, every transaction, every shadowy deal. They weren't just going after Capone the gangster. They were going after Capone the businessman, the man who thought he was untouchable. And finally, after years of ruling Chicago with an iron fist, after countless murders, bribes, and betrayals, Capone had finally made a mistake he couldn't escape. The walls were closing in, and this time there was no one left to save him. October 17, 1931. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read: guilty. The word echoed through the packed room, sealing the fate of the most powerful gangster in America. Al Capone, the man who had ruled Chicago with fear, the man behind countless murders, the man who had built an empire on blood and prohibition, was going to prison. Not for the Valentine's Day massacre, not for the killings, not for the terror he had unleashed on the city, but for tax evasion. The same man who had laughed in the face of the law, who had bribed officials, who had ordered executions without a second thought, had finally been brought down by accountants and tax records. The Untouchables had done the impossible. They had crippled the empire that once seemed invincible. Capone tried to smile as he was led out of the courtroom, still dressed in his expensive suit, still clinging to the illusion of power. But the world had changed. The moment he stepped into his prison cell, the myth of Al Capone shattered. His enemies had won. His empire crumbled. And Chicago? Chicago moved on. His years in prison were not spent as a feared kingpin, but as a man slowly unraveling. Syphilis rotted his mind, his influence faded. By the time he was released, he was a shell of the man he once was. No longer the feared crime lord, no longer the mastermind. Just a sick, broken man living out his last days in exile. The Valentine's Day massacre had made him a legend, but in the end, it was also the beginning of his downfall. And with that, one of the bloodiest chapters in American history came to a close. But the echoes of that day, of the gunfire, of the terror, of the cold brutality that defined an era, still linger in the stories we tell, in the photographs that remain, in the brick wall that still stands as a silent witness to history. If you found this story gripping, make sure to subscribe for more historical crime documentaries. There are countless untold stories waiting to be uncovered, tales of power, betrayal, and the dark truths that shaped history. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next video.